Imagine this. A lone rider galloping through the night, lanterns swinging in the dark, a desperate warning on his lips. The British are coming. The phrase everyone learns in school. Now imagine this next moment. The screen cuts to black, and a voice calmly says, "Except none of that actually happened." That immediate shock, that instant crack in a story we all thought we understood, that's where this journey begins. Because behind the simplified legend of Paul Revere is a far more complex, strategic, and surprising truth. One that raises a modern question no one expects to ask. Why are some countries today taking aim at an 18th century American silversmith? As headlines and online narratives flash by exusions, political commentary, international critiques, the viewer is thrown into the middle of a mystery that's both historical and contemporary. This isn't just a ride through colonial America. It's a ride through shifting global power, propaganda battles, and the strange afterlife of a myth that refuses to die. The hook is simple but unsettling. Paul Revere didn't do what we think he did, and that misunderstanding, intentional or not, matters much more today than you'd ever believe. From there, the introduction opens by grounding the viewer in the purpose of the video, to uncover the real events of the midnight ride, the way his legend was constructed long after the actual revolution, and how this legend is now being challenged or strategically undermined by modern nations with their own narratives to push. The audience is told that the story they learned was never just about one man on a horse. It was about identity building, symbolism, and political storytelling. And now, as countries attempt to reshape America's origin myths for their own agendas, Paul Revere has become an unexpected battleground. Viewers are invited into an exploration that's part historical correction, part cultural investigation, and part geopolitical decoding. By the end of the intro, they understand exactly what's at stake. If the story of Paul Revere can be reshaped, then so can any national myth, and the question becomes, who gets to decide the version that survives? Paul Revere's story really begins long before that famous night, and if you only know him as a man shouting warnings from horseback, then you're missing the entire network, tension, and intelligence work that defined the American resistance. Paul Revere was not just a random patriot who happened to be in the right place. He was a respected silversmith, a political organizer, and most importantly, a trusted messenger within the Sons of Liberty. In Boston, where loyalties were divided and British surveillance was everywhere, trust was a rare currency. Revere earned through years of involvement in anti-British movements, producing political engravings, arranging meetings, spreading coded information, and cultivating connections with merchants, ministers, and militia captains. By the time April 1775 arrived, Revere wasn't just an option, he was the obvious choice for a critical warning mission. On the night of April 18th, Revere wasn't acting independently or impulsively. The riders' signals and escape plans were part of a larger alarm system, one designed to alert a countryside on edge. The famous lanterns in the Old North Church were not an improvisation but a prearranged code, 1 if by land, 2 if by sea. Revere didn't even place the lanterns himself. He coordinated them. His role was strategic, not symbolic. That night, as the British troops prepared to march toward Lexington and Concord, Revere set out on a carefully planned route, avoiding patrols, stopping at the homes of militia leaders, and activating local resistance networks that could spread news far faster than one man shouting in the dark. And here's the part that shocks most people. He never shouted, "The British are coming." At the time, most colonists still considered themselves British. The actual warning would have made no sense. Instead, Revere used discreet phrases like "regulars are out," referring to the professional British soldiers. The myth of the midnight shout was a later invention, added because it sounded dramatic, simple, and patriotic. In reality, secrecy was essential. Had he actually galloped through the streets, yelling publicly, he would have been detained within minutes, and the mission would have failed. Another detail people rarely hear is that Paul Revere did not complete the ride, as it is described in legend. After linking up with William Dawes and meeting Dr. Samuel Prescott, Revere was detained by a British patrol. Dawes escaped but lost his horse shortly after, ending his ride. Prescott was the one who managed to get through the lines and deliver the final warning to Concord. But Revere's ride still mattered immensely, because he had already alerted dozens of households, triggered the alarm system, and reached Lexington to warn Samuel Adams and John Hancock personally. Those early steps meant the countryside was awake and mobilizing before the British even set foot on the road. So the real midnight ride was Dante Alone Hero's sprint. It was the activation of a highly coordinated resistance network at a moment when a single hour could change history. Revere was one node in a much larger intelligence operation, a man whose knowledge of routes, safe houses, and sympathizers allowed him to move crucial information with speed and precision. His true contribution was not dramatic shouting or cinematic heroism, it was strategy, trust, and organization. And that makes his real story far more impressive than the simplified version most textbooks offer. The real Paul Revere was not a character from a poem. He was a political operative executing a dangerous and essential mission at the dawn of a revolution. For decades after the American Revolution, Paul Revere was not even close to being the national hero we now imagine. In fact, he was barely remembered outside of Massachusetts. If you lived in the early 1800s and asked someone to list the most famous patriots, you'd hear names like Washington, Franklin, or Jefferson long before anyone thought of Revere. He was known locally as a silversmith, a notable artisan, a business owner, but not the midnight rider. His accounts of the ride existed, but they didn't circulate widely. America was still forming its identity, and Revere simply wasn't the figure chosen to represent the nation's defining values. All of that changed in 1860, when Henry Wadsworth Longfellow published Paul Revere's Ride, a poem that would rewrite an entire historical narrative. Longfellow wasn't trying to write a perfect historical account. He was trying to stir the conscience of the country on the eve of the Civil War. The North and South were inching toward conflict, and Longfellow believed the nation needed a unifying tale, one that reminded Americans of their shared fight for liberty. In that context, the story of a single determined patriot riding through the night to awaken the people became a powerful metaphor for courage, vigilance, and national duty. Longfellow simplified, condensed, and dramatized everything. He turned a coordinated intelligence operation into a one-man saga. He omitted key figures like Dawes and Prescott entirely. He placed Revere at the center of a battle that involved hundreds. And he created the most enduring myth of all, the idea that Revere galloped through the streets, shouting the iconic warning. None of these details were historically accurate, but they were perfect for storytelling. The poem spread quickly, and soon school children across the country were memorizing it. Teachers were using it to teach patriotism, and artists were painting Revere as a lone heroic figure silhouetted against the moonlit sky. As the American identity matured, so did the Revere legend. New textbooks adopted the poem's version of events because it was easy to teach and emotionally uplifting. At a time when the United States was expanding and asserting itself internationally, Revere became a symbol of readiness and defiance. He embodied the classic American values: independence, bravery, alertness to tyranny, and heroic individualism. Hollywood later adopted the myth too, with films and illustrations reinforcing the image of a determined rider saving the colonies through sheer will and courage. By the 20th century, the real Paul Revere had been replaced almost entirely by the mythic one. His story became a cultural artifact used to inspire national pride, and therein lies the power of historical myth-making. Nations don't just remember history, they sculpt it. They elevate certain figures to embody ideals that unity requires. Revere's legend became proof that one person could change the course of events, even if that wasn't literally true. Understanding how this myth formed is crucial today, because it explains why Paul Revere is still relevant more than 2 centuries later. Myths are not random, they are crafted, repeated, and protected because they serve a purpose. And once a figure becomes symbolic of a nation's identity, he stops belonging only to historians. He becomes a cultural weapon, a political tool, and sometimes a target. Historical figures usually fade into the past, but certain ones get revived, questioned, or attacked because they represent something bigger than themselves. Paul Revere is one of those figures. When modern countries criticize or reinterpret him, they aren't really targeting the person, they are retargeting the symbol that America has built around him. The reason is simple. Challenging foundational myths is a tool in modern political influence, propaganda battles, and narrative competition. Across the world, nations constantly shape stories about themselves and others. These stories are used to justify policies, inspire loyalty, or create skepticism about rival powers. When a country wants to challenge the United States' moral authority or ideological influence, one of the easiest soft power targets is the American Revolution. By undermining the myths that support that narrative, myths like Paul Revere's legendary ride, foreign actors can suggest that the U.S. has been exaggerating or distorting its founding story for centuries. And once you discredit someone's origin story, you weaken the values they claim to represent. Some countries highlight the inaccuracies in Revere's myth to suggest that the U.S. systematically rewrites history to make itself look heroic. They point out that Longfellow's poem elevated Revere while erasing others, or that the famous warning cry was invented, or that the lone hero narrative oversimplifies a complex uprising. These criticisms aren't wrong historically, but the motives behind amplifying them today are often political. For example, when state-run media from rival countries pushes these critiques, the goal isn't to teach Americans about historical accuracy, it's to paint the U.S. as a nation built on propaganda and self-flattering myth-making. Why Revere specifically? Because he's one of the most recognizable symbols of American rebellion. He represents action, courage, and defiance against imperial power. Undermining him allows modern critics to flip the narrative. How can America lecture others about democracy or freedom when its own national stories are exaggerated? That message resonates internationally, especially in regions where tensions with the U.S. are high. Revere becomes a tool in a larger rhetorical strategy. There's also the global trend of historical revisionism. Countries revisit the past to support today's politics. They may reinterpret revolutionary movements, colonial histories, or foundational myths to reinforce their own ideological positions. When they portray Revere's legend as propaganda, they position themselves as the truth-tellers, casting America as the storyteller that constructs fiction for patriotic benefit. This strategy isn't new. Throughout history, nations have weaponized other nations' heroes. But with social media, these narratives spread faster and reach audiences who may not know much about American history. The targeting of Revere also fits into a broader competition of narratives. The American Revolution has long been used by the U.S. to promote ideas of democracy, independence, and struggle against tyranny. Countries at odds with American policies sometimes counter by reframing the revolution as chaotic, hypocritical, or driven by elites rather than oppressed citizens. Revere's myth becomes an easy entry point into that argument. They claim, if this story is exaggerated, what else is embellished? It encourages doubt, not just about Revere, but about the entire moral foundation of American political identity. The real significance lies not in the man, but in what he represents. Revere is a symbol of American exceptionalism, the belief that the U.S. follows a unique path defined by liberty and courage. When that symbol is attacked, the goal is not historical accuracy, but ideological disruption. Understanding these motives reveals a deeper truth. History isn't just about the past. It's a battleground for shaping the future. Myths survive because they serve a purpose, and they are challenged because they threaten someone else's purpose. In the end, Paul Revere's story reminds us that history is never just a record of events. It's a reflection of what societies choose to remember, reshape, or challenge. The real Midnight Ride was a coordinated act of resistance. The legend was a tool for unity, and the modern criticism reveals how powerful national myths remain in global politics. When a figure becomes a symbol, they become part of a larger struggle over identity and influence. Understanding Revere's real role, his myth, and his modern relevance shows us why history matters, not because it's perfect, but because it's contested. Paul Revere's myth and reality show how nations shape history and why those stories still spark political conflict, influence, and identity today.